What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Table Talks, another solo session of myself just having a discussion, for you, the viewers, to listen to. These just come and go when they appear in my mind. I don't really have, a plan for future episodes at the moment. I've been hitting people up. Still waiting to figure out a time and date to do the Andy Schrock interview. He's already agreed to it. He sounds really excited. He's been sounding really excited to do it. He's a very busy person, so I don't blame him at all for taking a little bit longer than I expected for us to do it, which I didn't really have expectations on when to do it. But that will, come out sooner than later. Been connecting with more people within the city, within the country, hoping to do more interviews, more podcast episodes. But for right now, we're going to kind of dive in the discussion of freedom. Hey everyone, before we continue the segment, don't forget to subscribe, like, dislike, leave a positive comment, leave a negative comment. I don't care. Thanks for watching, and now on to the program. And freedom versus whatever's the opposite of freedom. If it's, security, if it's slavery, if it's oppression, there's, this conversation of, freedom is a peculiar one, because when we talk about freedom, we don't really have, let's look up real quick. What are some synonyms for freedom? Freedom, liberty, independence, autonomy. Those I think are probably, liberty, liberation. And even then, I mean, you have this very wide spectrum of how people interpret freedom, because at the end of the day, these are freedom and whatever the opposite of freedom is, are man-made constructions, man-made words. At the end of the day, when we think of the most, the situations, the examples of people or groups who have been entirely free, or people or groups who have been entirely not free, or oppressed, or slaves, there is there's something to be said in regards to this is man on man. This isn't a God giving people freedom. This isn't a God taking people's freedom away. Regardless of what the scriptures have told us throughout time, where these scriptures come from, at the end of the day, I myself am a faithful individual. I typically keep that internally. Not to say that I don't do things to express my faith, but I definitely don't express my faith onto individuals, or on the groups of people. If someone asks me about my faith, we can definitely, have a discussion about it. I'm, more than happy to talk about, what I believe and, where I come from. But I'm not one to ever shove my, thoughts, beliefs, opinions down anyone's throat, or to think that, that my beliefs are better or right in a sense, than someone else's beliefs, or someone else's beliefs being wrong. Because there's no entity, that's, exposed itself to humanity to, essentially be quote unquote God, or, some entity that, can make these decisions and can universally say, yes, this is what freedom is. yes, this is not what freedom is, or this is what happiness is, this is what sadness is, or this is what good is, this is what bad is. That's obviously the two main things that it comes down to, good and bad, because this is this is what the discussion essentially is rooted in: good and evil. We have freedom and oppression because of where good and what stems from good and evil. So I wanted to have this discussion because this is something that always has came up in other discussions that I've had, regardless if it's with friends, peers, teachers, colleagues, associates. It doesn't matter. The conversation typically always leads back to, at some point in the conversation, it always leads back to understanding that good and bad are everywhere, and good and bad are within everyone. It doesn't matter if you are the most underprivileged individual in the world or if you're the most privileged individual in the world. Both of you will experience good and bad at some point in your life. It's universal for everyone. And with the conversation of freedom, typically, when people think of freedom, they think of having the ability to do, what they want, when they want, without being questioned. Freedom typically comes with the thought that, the individual is happy. I'm happy because I'm doing the things that I want to. I'm free to go do, this or that. And obviously there's a limit to it. I'm not free to just go, attack anyone or end someone's life. That would make me feel morally, wrong. I would feel disgusted myself. I'm even disgusted with myself with even having the thoughts of myself doing, things like that. But that happens. People legitimately think that they have, this extent of freedom to where they can, do stuff like take someone's life, regardless if it falls under, the language of law, because at the end of the day, death is death, murder is murder. It doesn't matter really how it's done. It doesn't matter, how one takes a life, and it can even go to the extent to where it doesn't matter if you are the one not pulling the trigger. If you are the one in charge, making the calls, making the decisions, the blood is on your hands too. And with that being said, at the end of the day, when it comes to my faith and my belief, and I'd say majority of people's faiths and beliefs, that you're going to be judged in the afterlife, if there is an afterlife per se, and regardless of what sort of laws in whatever lands dictate what happens, it doesn't matter if there's laws and lands here on earth right now that make it appropriate or make it legal to kill people. It's disgusting, honestly. When you think about that there's people in power who say, oh, but it's we have we're legally allowed to do this. So and then you have also people who simpletons who commit, that we see commit heinous acts, crimes, taking people's lives, regardless of, how the act was done. It's when we get into, that part of the spectrum of freedom, it gets very ugly. Because, with the great power of freedom comes the great responsibility of, how are you going to use that freedom? And, it is, a very, complex, complicated nature of humanity, this idea of, freedom and, being happy and, or what dictates, an individual, and their happiness, and if they're free or not. Because there's a lot of people here, who live, day to day, who express, happiness and whatnot. But you also have another camp of people who observe the world in a very you know skeptical, cynical manner. And I'm not saying that I don't do that. Obviously, with some of the stuff I just said, that is very cynical and very dark conversation to be have. But there is an argument to be made that the type of lives people live, waking up in the morning, going to your job, going to the grocery store, yada yada yada. There is an argument to be made that freedom doesn't actually exist, because we have sets of rules to follow, basically wherever we go. It's the topic within the field of legal history, that takes place and talks about stuff like natural law and human rights, bringing up questions like what defines a citizen, what defines rights, what are rights, who governs this land, who governs that land, who governs these waters. And the more the deeper conversation to be have opens up the door in regards to what are rights. Are rights things that make us free, or are rights things that kind of put us into shackles? Like, you have the right to do this, you have the right to do that. Why does someone need to tell me what I have the right to do? That's one of the arguments to be made. But there's also, the argument to be made that if there are no rights, then this concept of the what's the word I'm looking for? The state of nature. That's what they refer to as when there's no law to govern a land. You consider it the state of nature, where anyone can do whatever they want. And the two famous people that talked about the state of nature in throughout history are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes, obviously, reflecting on the time he was alive and the times that he was writing his stuff like the Leviathan. He was living in the midst of the English Civil War, a very dark and brutal time in English history. So and that's why he wrote the Leviathan. The Leviathan literally is the entity that kind of tells you how you live your life. Not necessarily how you live your life, but what sort of rights you have, how limited your freedom is, so on and so forth. And John Locke, on the other hand, expressed that sort of conversation more so as like a beacon of hope, a beacon of light, in a sense. If I'm getting that correctly. It's been a while since I talked about these guys. I got John Locke right here. Let's see real quick. Locke and the Man and Locke and the Writer. To the two treaties of government being like the essence of who John Locke is. Social and political theory. Let's see real quick. It's been a while since I've used these books. I think this is the first time I've opened the book in the middle of Table Talks discussion, which is pretty nice. Let's see if I can find something in the context. Not the bibliography. Second treatise. Okay. I'm just gonna open. Okay, so an essay on concerning the origin and context of civil government. Second treaties of government. I'm just going to read just this random piece right here. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature or his rule, for his rule. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what the legislative shall enact according to the trust put in it. Freedom, then, is not what Sir R.F. tells us. Let me continue, actually. Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to, open up a book and, go in silence. But yeah, I mean, you have John Locke, you have Thomas Hobbes. I'm pretty sure I have Hobbes right there too. Hobbes's Leviathan is right here. Yep. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is arguably the greatest piece of political philosophy written in the English language. Written in a time of great political turmoil, Hobbes' life spanned the reign of Charles I, the civil wars, the Commonwealth, and the blanking on how to pronounce this word. But anyways, Leviathan is an argument for obedience to authority grounded in analysis of human nature. I'm telling you, man, if you want to get a better understanding of freedom and security and the state of nature, read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and John Locke's The Treaty of Two Governments. Because this is, their words echo and will continue to echo, throughout all of human history. So yeah, where did I want to go from here regarding this? Yeah, I mean, freedom, how we determine happiness, it's just crazy to think about because, I'm, reflecting on my life. I wake up all the time. I go to work. I go to the grocery store. I do everything I can to take care of the people around me. One can argue that, I'm shackled. I'm restrained by, what my life has become. I don't have the ability to just do whatever I want. But at the end of the day, what does that even mean, to do whatever you want? I'm not there. There is a limit on, what the human mind as an individual desires. I was watching this documentary yesterday. I just had it on in the background. It was a documentary about the most dangerous homes in the world. Homes that, they're like homes built on very tall trees built by native people from homes that are these glass capsules that are embedded in the side of mountains. Crazy documentary, really cool, really fascinating. But one thing that I started to think about in the moment of the documentary where they were showing these native people in Indonesia, they were building these homes at the top of what could span from anywhere between 30-foot trees to 100-foot trees. And I was thinking, not even thinking about what the documentary was talking about directly, but I was just thinking of those natives and the future generations of those natives, and those generations, those children essentially living in the moment right now in those native tribes. That's all they know. They don't know what this life is like. They don't know what a phone is like. They don't know what social media is like. They don't know what waking up to go to a 9 to 5 is like. They don't know what a car is like. They don't know what sidewalks are like. They don't know, there's just, and with that, they are content. They are happy. They live their lives knowing what full awareness of what to expect. This is not, they're not just born into this life and, the entire world just gets, put in their mind, and, they just all of a sudden desire, like, oh, I want to, my desire is to go to America and become an influencer on TikTok. And no, these people, the people around the world very well, subconsciously know their limits when it comes to freedom and what they want to do with their lives and what they can do with their lives. I'm not over here, weeping and moaning because I, am not like, I'm not riding in rocket ships to the moon, or I'm not, figuring out the cure to cancer, or I'm not like, I'm not famous, or I don't have like a shitload of money. Like, no, I know my limits. I know this is my life, what I experience day to day. And I'm always prepared. I try to just be in the mentality to always be prepared for what life offers. I always tell myself, put me in whatever scenario, I'm going to make the most out of it. So yeah, I mean, it's, it is an interesting discussion to have regarding, freedom and whatever the opposite of freedom is. Slavery, oppression, security. I definitely, when it comes to, me and what I think, am I free? I think, I'm very happy with my life. I honestly have really nothing to complain about ever. The things that I do complain about, I wouldn't even say I'm like a complainer. I'm more so like a crap talker. I talk a lot of shit. I engage, with people online who are, the radicals, who need to be put in their place. Like I've mentioned before, and I'll keep mentioning it again. Now, is the time to say whatever you want. It's never been more important now than now to literally say whatever you want. And regardless of that, though, I'm not complaining about what I don't have. I can't even think about, I have a list of stuff that I need to get. I need to get new Muay Thai gloves. I need to get, a new gi. I need to, there's a couple things I want to get, but at the end of the day, that's what I work for. I work to earn the money to get the things that I want. And they're not unrealistic stuff. I'm not out here, doing things like, wasting my money on random material that doesn't benefit me or, the people around me. That's obviously another conversation to be had regarding, like, how you live your life and whatnot, and, living life and, navigating life. But this conversation, is just a political philosophy on freedom, state of nature. Are we actually free? When we live under the rule of law, are we actually secure if there is no rule of law? What are people like naturally, without there being rule of law? That's what, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes tackled within, both their books. So yeah, definitely, I'll just leave it there. Not sure, it's 9:45. I think I started this at 9, maybe a little bit after 40 minutes. I'll leave it there. And the only advice I'll give is to just, read the Leviathan and read the two treaties of government, the two treaties, not the treaties of two governments, the two treaties of government. So yeah, until next time, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment on the video, share with your friends and family, and I will catch you next time. Hey everyone, thanks again for watching. It means a lot. Don't forget again to subscribe, like, dislike, leave a positive comment, leave a negative comment. I don't care. Thanks again for watching. We'll catch you next time.